Guess Tim didn't get the memo about wearing black tonight. I always appreciate when our young men are involved in our worship, and Daryl and Christian did a great job this evening. We would expect that. Christian had guard this morning, and so he's had a busy day already. Rachel had to work, and with a young one, I suspect she's more than exhausted this evening. She's not out tonight feeling a little under the weather as well. I reminded him that when our children were young, it seemed like I came to worship by myself a lot. We would get one well and the other would be sick. And guess what? There was no one to take care of the one that was well. So the well one stayed home with the sick one. And that happened more than I can count. But Diane was always so good with them, and it always worked out. But it's just part of life. You have to live with the sickness that comes with little ones, and it gets worse, Christian, when they get in school, especially those early years. But it does ultimately get better. I was thinking of several who are under the weather from the congregation right now, not with us. And Bev was sick last weekend, and of course this weekend she and Elsie went south to visit Sharon, who's doing much, much better now. And if I took the time tonight just to tell you about the sick folk, there wouldn't be time for a message, and I don't want to do that because we're rapidly drawing to a close in our study of the minor prophets, 12 in number, and after tonight, if I've counted correctly, we have 3 to go. I hope it's been a study that has been helpful to you. You'll have a better appreciation for the prophets and a better understanding of the messages that are conveyed. If you're looking at the picture or pictures on the board behind me, the first is a representation of King Jehoiakim, who was the king during the reign, or rather during the time of Jeremiah, leading up until the time of Zephaniah. And in the 36th chapter of Jeremiah, there's a historical narrative about Jeremiah's scroll being turned over to the king, and it's in winter, and he's in his winter house, and there's a fire in the fire pot, and as the scroll is read, the king takes a knife and cuts the scroll and throws it in the fire, and he does so until the entire document is consumed. He thought in that way he would eliminate Jeremiah's work. But guess what? Jeremiah just got to work writing again, and the next scroll was longer than the one the king destroyed, which doesn't really surprise me. Preachers can preach a sermon once. The next time it gets a little longer. Third time it gets really long, and by the fourth time everybody's asleep. So it doesn't surprise me that Jeremiah's second scroll was longer than his first. I bring that up because the second slide is just a representation, artistic representation of a prophet. I don't have a clue how Zephaniah looked, and this is just a way of pointing to a man who represents God to the people doing his work. For the background of this particular book, we point out that Zephaniah literally means Jehovah hides, or Jehovah has hidden. And I don't know the significance of that. I just know that that's the meaning of the word. There are actually 3 fellows in the Old Testament who are known by this particular name. 1 Chronicles 6:36, one of the singers appointed by David was Zephaniah. In Jeremiah 21, verse 1, one of the king's servants sent to Jeremiah was a man by the name of Zephaniah, probably not the author of this particular book of prophecy, because he is in the service of the king, and at this time the king is not a faithful servant of God. He's not leading the children of God in the direction God would have them to go. And that leads us to the third mention, and that's in the text of this book in the first verse, the prophet who authored this particular message. He wrote his book, and remember, when we do dates, we're always talking in generalities. I cannot tell you, for the most part, that this date is certain, but it is in the ballpark. It may have been a year or two before, or a year or two after, but approximately 625 BC. It's during the reign of Josiah, and Josiah was the last good king of the southern kingdom of Judah. The reforms that Josiah initiated, it seems, have already been underway for a while, because Zephaniah doesn't mention any of them, nor does he indicate that they need to be undertaken. It seems as though they have already done whatever good they're going to do, because Zephaniah only mentions a remnant left to worship Baal. When Josiah came on the scene as king, he was a youngster of 8 years old. And the high priest essentially controlled the government until Josiah was in his late teens and could actually rule. And when he did get himself in a position where he could exert the authority of a king, among the things he did was command that the temple be cleaned and renovated. And in doing that, they discovered a copy of the law, which he then demanded to be read before all the people. And out of that came the reforms that Josiah initiated. They seem to have done some good, so that when Zephaniah writes his book, there's just a small number of those worshiping Baal. He also mentions the king's children in chapter 1, verse 8. So that gives you some idea, again, of the general area in which Zephaniah works. Again, the king Josiah came to the throne as a boy, and so a number of years in his reign would elapse before he would marry and have children. So it's not early but late in the reign of Josiah. It seems that Zephaniah's home was probably Jerusalem, just by what is mentioned in the overall context of the book, and a specific reference in verse 4 to the city of David. There are two features in Zephaniah that are unusual, because they're not found as they are generally found in the other books of prophecy. When I say two features and then tell you they're not found, that seems kind of contradictory, but when you begin to read a book of prophecy, there are certain things that you inevitably are going to look for, and you don't necessarily find them in this book. He doesn't seem to have any interest at all in this brief book relative to the practical reforms of King Josiah. You would expect, given what Josiah set out to accomplish, and Zephaniah being a contemporary, that he'd have a lot to say about that. There'd be a lot of preaching and teaching, urging people to embrace these reforms and get their lives back on track and start being governed by the law again. And that really doesn't happen, which is surprising. Jeremiah, who is a contemporary of Zephaniah for part of his ministry, constantly is urging the people to reform, to get back to the old paths and the old ways. And you don't really find that in Zephaniah, which is rather unusual. Secondly, it seems that everything that has been done, ultimately, Zephaniah sees has failed. And so now, all he really focuses on is the wrath of God. Now, that's really interesting to me, because that's the opposite of what we generally see today in the religious world. It's all about love today. In fact, there are many people that want to deny that God is a wrathful, vengeful, just God who holds people accountable. But this prophet knows that that is indeed the case, and that's really the message that he seeks to convey. His is a rapidly changing world. By that, Ashurbanipal has died in 626 BC, and he is the last really powerful king of the Assyrians. It won't be long after this man's death that the Assyrian Empire really begins to crumble, and the reason is that God raised up the Babylonians to deal with the Assyrians. If you were here last Sunday night and listened to the message on Habakkuk, That prophet was asking, how long, God, are you going to let this continue? This terrible, wicked people that you've raised up to punish your own people. And the fact is, God did raise them up, and they destroyed the Assyrians, but they themselves ultimately would be destroyed as well by another nation God raised up, the Medo-Persians. So Babylon is in the ascendancy, reaching its probably zenith during the days of Nebuchadnezzar. On Thursday mornings, we were looking at the book of Nehemiah, and it's been interesting. Some of the names there are rather unusual, and I've been enjoying the pronunciations that we have given those names. Becky's smiling right now because she knows what I mean. But everybody can say Nebuchadnezzar. That's one of the longest names in Nehemiah, and that flows off the tip of our tongue because we're so familiar. That's a name that everybody recognizes because it was during this man's reign that Babylon really reached the pinnacle of power. And after him, things start to decline slowly but surely. So Assyria is in decline. Babylon is on the rise. And Zephaniah, like Jeremiah, can, as we say, read the handwriting on the wall. Jeremiah's message was, we're going to be taken into captivity. We just as well accept it and make the most of it, and nobody wanted to hear that. Zephaniah's message is, we've got it coming. God is a just God, and we brought this on ourselves, and it's really too late now to do anything about it. Idolatry has returned to Judah. If you look at all of Old Testament history and you really examine it carefully, you find that this is the problem that plagued the people of God over and over again. And it started all the way back in the wilderness. 6 months after they had left Egypt, they experienced the 10 plagues on the Egyptians while they were spared. They saw God part the sea, and they crossed as on dry ground, and then saw the waters return and destroy Pharaoh and all of his army. They had been fed by God every day with manna, and still, while Moses is on the mount, 6 months after they left Egypt, while he's on the mountain getting the law, Aaron is leading the people in pagan worship, has formed a golden calf, and when he comes off the mountain, Moses finds his brother Aaron and Israel involved in idolatry. And that continued throughout all of Old Testament history. It's not until we get to the New Testament that we find that the Jews have finally, at last, turned their back on the idolatrous practices of their neighbors. At this juncture in their history, Zephaniah can point out again that God has been forgotten, but God has not forgotten them and their sins. They will be punished. Thus, it becomes apparent that the reforms of Josiah that are chronicled in 2 Kings 22 have gone by the wayside, and Israel is back to her old adulterous ways. It's been said that Zephaniah, like Jeremiah, really preached to the hearts of the people, but to no avail. Their message was essentially, open your heart to God and to His Word, and let Him remake you, transform you into the people that you ought to be. And if it does not happen, you're going to incur His wrath. And they said it quite effectively. But people didn't listen. Preachers, like prophets, can be very effective and still not see visible results to their preaching. And I think we often forget that. Noah preached faithfully for over 100 years and made not a single convert beyond his immediate family. Jeremiah was a mighty prophet of God, and as far as we can tell, had no real visible success. He was successful in the eyes of God because he was faithful to God and God's message. And the same may also be said of Zephaniah. It seems that the people just gone too far. They're so deep in sin and idolatry that they're done. The case is hopeless. The King James speaks of them being settled on their lees. That probably doesn't mean much at all to us. If we were in the winemaking business, and I hope none of us are, but in biblical days, it was a very common practice for grapes to be pressed and wine to be made, and everyone would have understood this. It meant that they had become complacent. And because of their complacency, Zephaniah saw no real hope for them. The religious conditions were such that they had adopted the ways of their neighbors. Isn't that always the problem, though? We want to be like everybody else. But the true fact of the matter is, if we are conscientious men and women of God, our real goal is to be as God would have us be. But you note in 1 Samuel 8 what Samuel was told by representatives of the people. He's the last judge of Israel, and they say to him, "We want a king." Why do you want a king? Because all of our neighbors have a king. There's something very dangerous about conformity, especially when that conformity takes us away from God and his standards. That's what happened to Israel. That's why Assyria was used by God to destroy them. That's what happened to Judah, and that's why God raised up Babylon to deal with them. We've got to be careful. The command of God through the Apostle Paul in his second letter to Corinth was very simple. Come out from among them, meaning the world, and be separate, set apart, saith the Lord. John wrote, "Love not the world, nor the things that are in the world." Paul said to Timothy, "The foundation of God stands sure, having this seal. The Lord knows them that are his. Let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity." There is something unique, special about God's people. Should have been true with Zephaniah's contemporaries, should be true today with Christians. Our goal is not to adopt the ways of the world. Our goal is to maintain faithfulness to the will of our Father. Now, this is a brief book of 3 chapters. It can be outlined as follows. Chapter 1, threatening and judgment. The Lord will sweep the earth clean. The day of the Lord will come. If you were listening as Christian read the text to introduce our study tonight, you would have heard these words: "I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, declares the Lord." He's going to clean things up. But he's going to do it in a way that he will eliminate. He will bring judgment upon the transgressor. Chapter 2 contains warnings and admonition, prophecies against foreign nations. They're not going to escape. The Lord's mercy, however, ought to lead to repentance. Every time God intervenes in history and brings disaster upon a people, the purpose is to bring them to their senses. All of us have seen that very kind of thing play out in our own lives, perhaps on a personal level and certainly on a national level. Isn't it sad that it takes some catastrophic event to cause people to look up and to realize there is something greater than self? Do you remember when the Challenger exploded? I can close my eyes and still see the picture of that debris and everything as a result of that explosion. And I can remember the words of, at that time, President Reagan about, essentially leaving this earthly realm and touching the face of God kind of thing. And people, I believe all over this nation, for a moment at least, were struck with the reality that life is extremely fragile and that there's more to life than the moment. We must think of eternity. The same thing happened when the towers fell. And it's just sad that it takes those kinds of things to really bring people to their senses, if just for a moment. And that's essentially what Zephaniah and many other prophets say. God intervenes, and he intervenes as a just God. He brings vengeance up on sinners. But the purpose of his intervention and judgment is to bring us to our senses, to bring us to our knees, to lead us to repentance. But sadly, it often doesn't work. But it's not the fault of God, it is our own. Chapter 3 offers encouragement and promise. It speaks of the sins of Jerusalem, and we'll spend a couple of minutes on those, and asserts a future salvation, which would come ultimately through Cyrus, the king of the Medes and Persians, who would permit the deportees, the exiles in Babylon, to return and to rebuild their temple and their city. But it speaks to far more than that. It really points down the road to the coming Messiah who will bring hope to all of humanity. Let's look at the sins then of Jerusalem and Judah as they're pointed out in chapter 3, verses 2 and following. But I'm going to start with verse 1 because it's one of those woes that prophets frequently use. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. Woe upon Jerusalem. She is rebellious, and therefore she is defiled or contaminated. But why? She listens not to God's voice. She listens to no voice. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave nothing till the morning. Her prophets are fickle, treacherous men. Her priests profane what is holy. They do violence to the law. So, this judgment of God, which will befall Jerusalem and Judea, is directly tied to their rebellion against God's authority or their sin. And here, as the prophet begins to close out his brief message, he lists those sins. They obey not the voice of God. The problem was not then, nor is it today, an inability to hear God speak. The problem has always been a refusal to listen when God speaks. I mentioned already this great emphasis on the love of God. It is because of a change in preaching or emphasis a few decades ago that we have the religious malaise of the modern era. There was a time, not all that long ago, when even in denominational pulpits, the Bible would be opened and the scriptures would be read, and there would be common agreement among almost all religious people relative to moral issues. But 40, 50 years ago or so, a change started to occur. And rather than going to the scriptures and urging people to listen to God and heed his word, the message was transformed into a message of love. That's all that really matters. Just love God. After all, God is love, and if we will learn to love, that will take care of everything. You see, the problem with that is this. You cannot love God correctly if you do not first listen to him carefully. To love God, we have to do what he bids us do. Not what we want to do, but what he wants us to do. If you want to really clear statement on that, read John 14, start with verse 15, and go through verse 24. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. If you love me, you'll hear my voice. If you love me, you will do what I command. And he who does not do what I say does not love me. You see the correlation between listening and loving? They weren't listening. They could not love. They would not obey the voice of God. He had spoken through Jeremiah, through Zephaniah, through others, but they would not listen, so they persisted in sin, rebellion against God's word. They would not receive correction. Sometimes difficulties come to get us back on the right path. In fact, I would say to you, often that is the case. But it doesn't always work. In fact, it doesn't work all that often. And when it does work, the change is not long for many. But the fault does not lie with God. The fault lies with us. They trusted not the Lord. There is a tendency to think that military might and careful preparation for defense and those kinds of things are what provides security to a nation or people. And I'm certainly not opposed with a strong defense. I think it's the best offense. But there is no defense strong enough to deliver a people who've turned their backs on God. It was Solomon who wrote, "Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to every people." This is the downfall of the people of Judah. They would not trust God. They trusted in others. In fact, Josiah, the king who reigned while Zephaniah prophesied, lost his life in battle on the plains of Megiddo because he led the army of Judah in an effort to keep Pharaoh Necho of Egypt with joining forces with the Babylonians. He was actually coming to the aid of the Assyrians. What a tragic mistake. Lost his life. He should have just trusted God to protect them and stayed out of it. But he would not, and it cost him dearly. They would not draw near to God. What's the promise of Scripture? Draw nigh to him and he will draw nigh to you. If you want to be closer to God, you got to work to get closer. He'll meet you more than halfway. But as we so often say, he will never force himself on anyone. It is up to us to follow the path charted for us in his word to get closer to our Maker. He speaks of civil corruption, chapter 3, verse 3. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave nothing till the morning. This is an indictment of the politics of the 7th century BC. You didn't know better, you'd think it was an indictment of the politics of the 21st century AD, would you not? We desperately need to return to a time when people in positions of leadership are people of character, who are honest and truthful, men and women of integrity, who put the people before the party, the interest of the nation before their own personal interest. That was not true in Zephaniah's day, and it often is not true even now. And it's not just that the politics are messed up. Religion suffers the same plight. Again, her prophets are fickle, treacherous men, and her priests profane what is holy and they do violence to the law. The people who should have known better than anybody else ignored it, and in fact did the opposite of what God's servants ought to do. So it's not surprising that the situation that Zephaniah encounters is as dire as it is. Now, what do you take from this book and what the prophet had to say? Well, the first thing that I believe we ought to understand is that the wrath of God is a terrible thing when it's turned upon sin. No, I don't accept this idea that's so common today that because God is a God of love, that there is no accountability, there will be no consequences, that heaven is real but hell is not. In fact, God is not God if there is a heaven but no hell, because he would not be just. And by very definition, God is a good and just God. The retribution that falls upon sin is not the fault of God, but the fault of men who reject God. And again, you really just need to read verses 2 and 3 of the first chapter to get a vision of this wrath. You find that the day of the Lord is inevitable. And understand, when the day of the Lord is encountered, it generally has at least a twofold meaning. The first meaning is the judgment that God will inflict upon people by the use of others, as he did the Assyrians by using the Babylonians, and the Babylonians to punish the Jews, and the Persians to punish the Babylonians, kind of thing. But there is even a greater day of the Lord, and that's the day when God, through his Son, will judge the world in righteousness, what is described in Revelation 20 as the great white throne judgment. There is a day coming when we will be called upon to give an answer for the choices we have made in life. And if we reject God, Christ, and truth, the Lord will honor our choice and be compelled to reject us. There's an interesting statement in Hebrews chapter 10. We generally focus on verse 25, the emphasis on not forsaking the assembly. But in reality, what follows is even more insightful. If we sin willfully, after that we received a knowledge of the truth, there remaineth no more sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful looking for of judgment and fiery indignation. Our God is a consuming fire, the text goes on to say, and in the very next chapter asserts it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. A day of the Lord is coming, and when that day comes, if we are not ready, we will never be ready. There's an earnest warning that ought to bring men back to God. Chapter 2, verse 3, I think, demonstrates it. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land who do his just commands. Seek righteousness. Seek humility. Perhaps you may be hidden. Isn't that the call that still ought to resonate with us? Should we not be seekers after truth? Seekers after God, knowing that he's not far from any of us. In fact, in him we live and move and have our very being. And if we look for him, we can indeed discover him. And contemplating the day of the Lord and the judgment that is to come is certainly a strong incentive to seek righteousness. The faithful are known of God. That's the purpose of chapter 3, 14 through 20. And that's still the facts today. It's never been our role as Christians to determine who is or who isn't saved, who is or who isn't going to heaven. That is God's prerogative, and he knows, and he always knows correctly. The foundation of God really is sure. The Lord knows them that are his. So let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity, 2 Timothy 2:19. In Revelation 14, there's this beautiful, beautiful picture of the redeemed. And in verse 4, we are told who the redeemed are. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. If you want to escape the wrath of God, be ready for the day of the Lord, follow Jesus. Follow anyone or anything else, and you will be unprepared. That day is coming as surely as judgment came upon Judah. And if we're not ready, we have no one to blame but ourselves. I wish there were a way that the whole world could come to understand what lies ahead and be motivated to prepare before it's too late. I can't reach the world, but I can remind myself and all of you, let's leave this place determined that when that day comes, we'll share in God's blessings, God's goodness, God's riches and glory, and avoid the wrath that will befall the unprepared. We close with the final verse tonight, Zephaniah 3:17. The Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. He will save. He will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. He's on our side. He's pulling for us. He's calling us to him through the person of his own Son. It's up to us to answer the call according to his will, to listen to his voice and obey while we can. And you have opportunity